has largely been underreported, with Almiron and Zopadou describing it as a media blind spot. Only one study by Morris, who looked at the reporting of the meat-free Mondays movement in the UK, has suggested that demeatification is very slowly beginning to take place in the UK media. So against this background, I wanted to explore several things in this research project. The first is whether the relative meat environment silence persists in more recent UK media. And second, what is actually being said about meat, and consequently, whether demeatification is indeed taking place. So to this end, I explored anti-meat narratives and pro-meat counter-narratives. For example, meat is bad versus meat isn't so bad. What solutions or recommendations regarding diet and the environment are offered, such as eat less meat, and how attitudes towards two separate aspects of meat, its consumption and its production, are portrayed in the media. That is, whether the media are in favour of meat, against it, or neutral. So I'll just quickly share some of my methods and results with you. I gathered meat-related articles published throughout 2019 from 8 of the most popular online news sites used in the UK. We have 2 broadcasters that aim for impartiality in the BBC and Sky News. And I should probably highlight at this point that Sky News UK is quite different from Sky News Australia in this respect. We have 2 right-wing newspapers in the Daily Mail and the Sun, 2 left-wing ones, The Guardian and The Mirror, and 2 youth-focused online news media sites at BuzzFeed and Lad Bible. I collected 947 articles in total, and of these, 116, or 12.2%, belong to the environment topic, and articles could belong to more than one topic. Previous research that has also categorised meat-related articles into similar topics has generally found smaller proportions when it comes to the environment. Childs, for example, found 9% of his meat-related articles belong to this topic. But I should also point out that Charles found that only 3% of his articles belong to the topic of vegetarian, whereas we have over 40% belonging to our similar topic of plant-based. A lot of these stories are about celebrities trying a vegan diet and either loving it or hating it, or about new plant-based products in places like supermarkets, Macca's, or the British pastry chain Greggs. Given that my search term was meat, it's interesting to see that such a great proportion of articles discussed meat-free food. So on the back of this, we can begin to say 2 things. First, that media coverage of the meat-environment relationship has increased slightly. And secondly, that the media coverage of plant-based food has increased significantly, in tandem with its increase in popularity over the last few years. So moving on, let's look at anti-meat narratives and pro-meat counter-narratives. Hopefully you can see this graph. But to summarise some key findings, the most common narrative, appearing as you can see in just over 3/4 of articles, was that meat consumption or production is generally just bad for the environment. This was followed by the idea that meat leads to high levels of greenhouse gas emissions and that it is a leading contributor to climate change. Deforestation and land use and land change were also prominent topics. Conversely, there were far fewer counter-narratives or pro-meat narratives. Just under a third generally questioned or denied the negative impact of meat on the environment, or suggested that certain forms of farming or meats are environmentally friendly. A quarter argue that certain farming methods do not have a high carbon footprint, which falls under the greenhouse gas variable, followed by those that argue that certain types of farming are in fact sustainable. As you can see, overall, the anti-meat narratives were between 2 and 3 times more common than the pro-meat narratives, and this tended to be consistent across all our media outlets. The next thing I explored was solutions, recommendations, and advice. As we can see, the dominant solution at just over 60% was to eat less meat. Other solutions followed at 32%, which included a meat tax, banning environmentally damaging foods such as meat, and more interestingly, insect-based pet food, and in one article, cannibalism. This was closely followed by eat less red meat or no red meat, while just over 1/5 of articles recommended adopting a fully vegetarian or vegan lifestyle. But again, this was largely consistent across our media outlets. And then the final thing I explored was the sentiment of articles in relation to meat consumption and the meat industry. So with regards to meat consumption, over half of articles were against meat eating, as you can see here, while just over 40% were neutral or contained a balance of arguments. Only 5% were in favour of meat consumption or against the shift to plant-based diets for environmental reasons. These arose generally in response to the Eat Lancet report, which was published in 2019, which recommended significant reductions in individual meat intake. And essentially, in these articles, a small selection of people weren't happy with what they perceived as the report endeavouring to restrict their dietary choices and therefore their liberties. Sentiment around the meat industry was a little bit different. Only 10% of articles were completely against the meat industry. 28% were against industrial-scale farming, but were in favour of more sustainable farming practices, largely coming from quotations from representatives from the National Farmers Union in the UK. We also observed a high proportion of neutral or balanced articles at almost 2/3. Significantly, however, no articles were in favour of the meat industry in its current largely industrial form, so that's good news. When it comes to sentiment, this is where we saw some slightly different results among the different news sources, and I know we don't have much time, so I won't go into too much detail, but I will just share a few observations. The highest proportion of our anti-meat consumption articles were found in the left-wing newspapers, The Guardian and The Mirror, both of which have strong environmental agendas, so no massive surprise there. And this was followed by the relatively impartial broadcasters, BBC and Sky. And this was also generally similar with regards to the meat industry. We only had 5 pro-meat consumption articles in total, and 4 of these came from the right-wing Daily Mail. As mentioned, this was mainly people's responses to the Eat Lancet report, for example, saying that they weren't prepared to live off just half a rasher of bacon a day. Nevertheless, it's interesting that the Daily Mail had a slight anti-meat tendency despite these articles, and this suggests that political leaning does not necessarily predicate a newspaper's meat environment opinions or agendas. So yes, I should point out that there was in fact very little separating the news sources. In general, all the media outlets, including the right-wing ones, were in agreement that meat consumption is bad for the environment, but were slightly more hesitant to cast blame on the meat industry. So here's just a summary of our key findings. There's the greater proportion of environment-related meat articles than previous studies have found. There's a greater presence of anti-meat narratives than pro-meat. Dominant recommendation was eat less meat. The dominant sentiment regarding meat consumption was against. We only had 5% in favour. And then the dominant sentiment regarding the meat industry was neutral, with more articles being generally more non-committal. And this was generally fairly consistent across all sources. So I will try to conclude very briefly now. Overall, I think it's fair not only to agree with Morris's observation that demeatification is taking place in the media, at least in the UK, but also to take it further by suggesting that a new normal is already underway in terms of the media's attitudes towards the impacts of meat on the environment, as well as its increased openness towards meat-free alternatives more generally. To focus on the environmental aspects, to my knowledge, and please do correct me if I'm wrong or if I'm missing something, this is the first study which has not only found a significant proportion of articles reporting on the meat-environment relationship, but which has also found the media to be generally in agreement, regardless of political leaning, that meat is bad for the environment. For this reason, I suggest it's no longer possible to describe the reporting of the meat environment nexus as a media blind spot. But to unpack things just a little bit further, these results also show that the media is placing far more responsibility on the consumer to eat less meat, rather than on the industry to produce less meat. Indeed, over 50% of articles were against meat consumption or in favour of more plant-based eating habits, while only 10% were entirely against the meat industry. Similar has been observed by Christiansen et al., who argue that the media's focus on consumer choice, and I quote, helps to take the responsibility off the necessary systematic changes that governments should be introducing and distracts attention from the holding to account of large polluting corporations, end quote. And this is despite the high and often undeclared emissions rates of meat and dairy companies. I'm hopeful, as I'm sure many other people are, that the most recent IPCC report published this month will draw further attention to this rather unfair disparity between consumer and industry responsibility, both by encouraging the industry to do more for the environment and also by altering the media's attitudes towards the meat sector by being less non-committal and slightly more vocal in its criticism of the industry. But only time will tell what actually happens in that respect. Another observation I'd like to draw attention to is the dominance of the eat less meat recommendation over eat no meat, with an approximate ratio of 3 to 1. This may reflect the perception of meat reduction as a comparatively more achievable dietary target than veganism or even vegetarianism. Numerous papers have shown that a significant barrier to adopting a vegetarian or vegan diet is the perceived difficulty of it, as well as individual enjoyment of meat. Meat reduction can thus be considered an easier and more enjoyable alternative to complete elimination, while still being a step in the right direction. But what about the future? I've mentioned already the IPCC report, which shows just how important it is now and in the near future to cut greenhouse gas emissions. While a lot of the focus is on fossil fuel use, the livestock industry is also blamed for its high emissions rates, such as carbon dioxide from deforestation and methane from fertilizers and ruminants. As such, while it's still well and good for individuals to adopt more plant-based diets, the IPCC makes it clear that now really is the time for the livestock industry to become a more responsible party and change its habits, rather than putting the focus solely on the consumer. My research has shown that it's now normal for the media to highlight the impact of meat on the environment and encourage the consumer to reduce his or her meat consumption, albeit with fewer references to sustainable livestock agriculture. But perhaps with the publication of this new report, together with the increasing and well-documented incidents of bushfires and flooding over the last few years, as well as more people generally questioning their meat-eating dietary habits in the wake of the pandemic, perhaps we'll begin to see increasing responsibility placed on the meat industry to also do their bit. But as I said, only time will tell, and I guess that's a project for the future. I will end it there.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was really interesting. I suspect that the UK is a little bit ahead of this than Australia, but there you go, lots to talk about later, I suppose. So let's move on to our next presentation, and thanks for keeping to time as well. We have Deb Anderson and Peppy Ronalds from Monash University in Australia speaking about It's Personal, Women's Journalism, Weather-Focusing Events and the Politics of Climate Crisis. Over to you, Deb and Peppy.
Thanks very much, Heather, and thanks to Julie for a great first presentation there. Just get my screen happening here. Hopefully that's showing now. So my name's Deb, and I'll be co-presenting with the wonderful Peppy, my colleague at Monash University. Okay, I'd like to begin by acknowledging traditional owners, the Bunurong and the Woiwurrung peoples of the East Kulin Nation, and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We acknowledge their ongoing strength in practicing what is the world's oldest living culture. Okay, so Bronwyn Adcock was surrounded by cremated trees when she saw the forest, so to speak. The former SBS Dateline reporter, who last decade moved off-grid to the coast south of Sydney, was working on a story for the monthly magazine. It was late 2019 and bushfire season had begun. A fire disaster was unfolding in northern New South Wales. And what caught her ear, she recalls, was a quote from a leading fire ecologist, Dave Bowman, who said, basically, what's happening and about to happen in Australia is going to be studied for decades to come around the world. And then the fires came to the south coast where she lives. The Currowan fire burned for 74 days. And when she phoned her editor at the monthly to download about our house nearly burning down, losing most of our property, my husband nearly dying, our whole town evacuated, she realised that this story was hers. Having experienced such terror, as we can see here, prompted a dramatic shift in journalistic and civic agency. And that's when it became, I guess, more personal. Now, if what historian Libby Robin says here is true, and
we can't see.
You can't see what?
We can see the PowerPoint display, but we can't see each slide.
You can't see each slide? Sorry, what do you mean?
We can see the editable display. So you might just need to scroll down on the editable display. Yeah, keep going down like that.
Really? It's not moving?
We just got to climate change is making Australia's experience with strange weather to there, so that's fine. But okay. It's not in play mode.
It's not in, and when I do this, it's not playing?
No.
No. If you just click on the thumbnails on the side, they should do the trick.
All right. Okay.
Sorry. Also, maybe we can.
Sorry.
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah.
Slideshow. That's not working any better there?
No, it's not.
No, all right. Okay, we will abandon that. We'll just go with thumbnails. Okay. Okay. Where was I? Yes. So if what Libby Robin is saying here is true, then I think the lessons of Australian journalism could be cause for monumental despair. Our scientists named the decade up to 2020 the critical decade for action on climate change with respect to the increasing risks of weather disasters. And yet our government's willful political blindness on climate persists, even with the IPCC's 6th assessment report delivering not very good news at all. The constitutive role of our news media is of scholarly concern, and for us too. It took Black Summer for many in the news media to, I guess, use a climate attribution frame in their disaster reporting, and then it was only in half of their reporting. That's up from a near silence on climate change after Black Saturday, so that's something. But as this book points out, there's a deficit, and it's one of agency. Okay. So what might the kind of reporting that can build a bridge to political change look like? So poet and activist Judith Wright reminds us that Australian nature is a living and creative force. And in this vein, we detect a direct response to both climate crisis and the deficits in journalism that is both personal and distinctively Australian. And in this woman's footsteps, it's being led by women. In this paper, we'll talk a little bit about what we've found so far with this kind of generic change in long-form journalism on climate in Australia. Here, weather disasters form focusing events, and our research is tracing the punctuated development of this work over that critical decade, from the Millennium Drought up to the New South Wales floods. Published near and far, this work speaks to both the local and the global. We call its proponents literary journalists as naturalists because they also follow in the footsteps of Rachel Carson, an ecologist and journalist who was delivering so they're kind of picking up her mantle to deliver the harrowing stories of our times. Men are doing this too, of course, and this project about women derives from a national study that includes both men and women on the changing shape of disaster reporting. But our critical intervention does relate to gender. As Louise North concludes here from this, the biggest study of female journalists in our country, academic researchers can't simply go on documenting this. We need to be part of challenging it too. So we want to ground our new knowledge in women's experiences, and we're uncovering a diversity of voices therein. Over to you, Peppy.
Thanks. Okay, so there's no explicit culture of long form or literary journalism or indeed creative non-fiction on nature or environmental concern in Australia. We have voices of First Nations women whose storytelling tradition does not distinguish between human and natural worlds. So these writers aren't simply concerned with ecological collapse, but also a wider relationship to country and invader harms inflicted. So they include, of course, writers like Claire G. Coleman and Natalie Coombs and Karen Wild. But as nature writer Inga Simpson laments, a colonial cringe towards Australian flora and fauna lingers alongside unresolved issues of belonging for non-Indigenous people. And nature writing for non-Indigenous women has become a mode for examining evolving relationships with landscapes. So in creative nonfiction, we find prominent voices balancing the seriousness of the times with a sense of wonder while conjoining literary styles with journalistic beats. They include people like Griffith Review editor Ashley Hay, journalist turned poet Anna Maria Weldon, Rebecca Giggs, who explores how people feel towards animals in a time of ecological crisis, journalist and author Anna Crine, and Jane Rawson, who wrote about the environment for The Conversation for many years. The writer's responsibility rises to the fore in long-form work that homes in on weather disasters. So, for example, Lucy Treloar ponders how fellow novelists will create meaning from the Black Summer events in her Meanjin essay, Writing the Apocalypse. Also, Charlotte Wood writes in The Guardian of stages of petulance, patient reasoning, then dread brought on by a new philosophical understanding of fear. So she says, I'm going to move on. Novelist Jennifer Mills explores frustrations with Australian inertia on climate for a European audience, as she wrote in a politically charged essay for the Danish for a Danish weekly, which was then translated into English and published on Literary Hub there. And then Guardian Foreign Desk reporter Helen Sullivan also writes literary and personal long-form pieces on Australian disasters in global terms, more often for a New Yorker or New York Times readership. Sullivan is actually studying her master's in climate change at the moment.
Okay. So extreme weather, which we're kind of focusing on now, has long served as a backdrop against which Australian culture defines itself. And in this territory, we find veteran long-form journalists with a scholarly streak, such as Associate Professor Meg Simons, who wrote this incredible piece, Crimea River, as a quarterly essay last year. And she chronicled decades of political failure to meet the needs of drought-stricken rural communities. Dr. Chris Kenneally is another journalist who she writes for The Atlantic, Slate, The New Yorker, for example, of bushfires in Australia as a case study in the realities of climate change. And Jo Chandler, an ex-Fairfax journalist, who in some ways led the way back in 2011 with her book, Feeling the Heat. And here she compares the most frightening journalistic assignments that she's ever had with the emotional impact of climate change. And we'll find many of these names of journalists in the best Australian science writing anthologies each year. And some of those writers are scientists too, such as Tasmanian ecologist Nicole Gill, who we think is one of the more interesting writers in this field. She's written a few times on connections to drought-prone and fire-affected place, and as an ecologist of choosing which battles to fight, or having the luxury to choose in a world morphing into new and terrifying forms. And as she wrote here, there's nowhere that is far enough from humanity to be safe. And she wrote that in the context of the 2016 bushfires in Tasmania, which of course damaged what they thought was rainforest protected by World Heritage. Over to you, Peppy.
So back in the present, colliding crises are taking centre stage. A more recent example is the anthology Fire, Flood, Plague, edited by Sophie Cunningham, who, as many of you would know, offered a sober appraisal of what Cyclone Tracy in 1974 means in the context of ever more destructive weather. In this anthology, she offers 26 Australian writers the space to respond to a year in which environmental unravelling met with the global pandemic. And interestingly, 16 of those are women. Joelle Gerges, who many of you will know from her environment writing, in her piece in The Guardian, relates watching the horror of planetary collapse in Black Summer to that of the death of her father, saying that we stood back helplessly, knowing that nothing could be done. Freelance journalist, a political journalist, Gabrielle Chan contributes to Recovery Story on Family's micro-food production project in the Murray River, which is using a metaphor for possibility in times of upheaval. And Jess Hill, journalist and author of the Stella Prize-winning See What You Made Me Do, considers Black Summer specifically in terms of power in fire, flood, plague. And I want to actually read out what she said, which I haven't done with the other ones. She says, but there's no running from it. It won't ever be over because it is not just one thing. It is not the catastrophic fires of last summer. It is not climate change, and it is not the coronavirus, though all are emblematic of the mess we're in. It is, in short, the shift we made from societies built on the principles of balance to what we have now, a dominant culture obsessed with power, over, and control. There's a neat little term for this culture of power over, patriarchy.
Thanks, Peppy. So to conclude, this quiet revolution of writing that we're finding contrasts sharply with daily news journalism's fixation on the shenanigans that are Australia's climate policy, or lack thereof. So responding to the need to deal directly with climate crisis, this work is operating on a human scale. It eschews the convention of dispassionate disaster reporting. It creates a moral imaginary through everyday lived understandings of disaster, often giving voice to the explicit political critique of everyday ordinary people. And that's quite rare in daily journalism. And it exposes the cultural dimensions of Australian climate literacy. For, as Bronwyn Adcock herself says, the failures of Australian leadership are all too real when the distance between yourself and the trauma that you cover collapse under a climate changed world. That's it from us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A beautifully timed 13 minutes there. Well done, team. And so much fascinating content. I just feel inspired to go and read a few of those books that you've mentioned there and articles. But moving right along, we're going to move to a different continent now, and we're joined by Mahita Ikani and her presentation, Source Stories, Narrative in Media Coverage of the Upper Jukskai. Hopefully I said that right. Rejuvenation Project. Over to you, Mahita.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. It's so great to be here. I'm going to also just dive in straight away by sharing my screen. There we go. I trust you can all see that okay. Let me just press
Yes,
play.
we can see it.
Cool. All righty. So the traditional disclaimer, this is really a work in progress, and I'm actually at quite early stages of trying to put together these ideas into a paper. So what I'm going to present here is quite empirical and analytical, and I'm still trying to figure out how to develop it on the theoretical level. So I would very much value any feedback that you guys have on that topic. So as a little bit of context, in South Africa, rivers are highly polluted with levels of toxicity and the threat to kind of human well-being periodically reported on in the press. For example, the example that you're looking at, in 2019 August, the Citizen newspaper reported on the pollution of the Henops River, which runs through the city of Tshwane. So polluted, so severely polluted that the journalist writes that life in these waters no longer exist. In 2017 April, the Mail and Guardian reported on the Olifants River, which flows through the platinum mining belt, calling it, quote, a river of shit, chemicals, metals. Another Mail and Guardian article just a couple of months later in 2017 reports that 50,000 litres of sewage flow into South Africa's rivers every second. Back in 2007, independent newspapers was reporting that Gauteng's rivers had E. coli levels of 240 times the acceptable level per 100 milliliters, and so on, right? The examples are several. According to a report released by the South African Human Rights Commission in February this year, they did a formal inquiry into the pollution of the Vaal River, which is one of the main sources of drinking water for Greater Johannesburg, our largest and most populated city. And the Vaal River is being polluted by raw sewage. And the Human Rights Commission found that this was a violation of human rights, I think quite obviously, but it is, I think, quite significant that such an important institution did an inquiry and released a formal report. 19 million people depend on that river for water, for drinking and domestic and commercial use. So in short, rivers in South Africa are highly, highly polluted and a huge environmental problem. And also, considering climate change, water security is going to be the most major issue affecting our region as a result of climate change. So in this paper, I'm looking specifically at the Jukskai, which is a small, non-navigable but perennial river that runs through Johannesburg. Johannesburg is a fascinating city. It is my home, and there's a wealth of critical cultural work on Johannesburg. I've put just a couple of key texts up if anyone's interested in critical work on the city. But quite interestingly, there's very little work that specifically looks at rivers in relation to the city and in relation to the complex social and cultural life of the city. So unlike other major cities in the world, Johannesburg is often kind of noted as a city without a river, a city without a large navigable river running through it. But we do have rivers. They're small, but they are nevertheless significant. And so today I'm specifically focusing on some work that's being done by an activist organization to try and rejuvenate one of our rivers, which is the Yukskay. So the Yukskay drains into the Crocodile River Basin and eventually joins the Olifants and connects with the Indian Ocean, just to give you a sense of how the flow of water, which starts in the city, ends up. Okay, so the interesting thing about the Yukskay River, and this is a drone shot of its daylight point, is that its source is underneath the city of Johannesburg. So before the city was built, there was a wetland in the eastern side of the city in the valley between two hills. And that was where several springs kind of came up through the wetlands and eventually trickled into this river. And the city was effectively built on top of it. So the source of the Yukskay is literally underneath the city of Johannesburg. And on top of that, the most densely populated neighborhood of the city, which is actually the most densely populated neighborhood on the whole continent because it is a high-rise neighborhood. So at the Yukskay source, a project to rejuvenate and remediate the river is being driven by a small NGO called Water for the Future, who are trying to forge a public-private partnership to clean up the river and remediate it. So like all of the other rivers that I contextualize this project with, the Yukskay is highly polluted. And Water for the Future, this small NGO, is trying to develop an innovative, participatory, sustainable urban drainage system to try and harness thunderstorms, prevent flooding, help to filter the water before it gets polluted in the river. And their aim is to build a green corridor from the daylight point. So the source of the city is underneath, the source of the river is underneath the city, and it makes daylight a few blocks away from its source. And then it runs in this kind of deep culvert for a few kilometers before kind of spreading out and winding through other settlements and other parts of the city. So Water for the Future is aiming to build a kind of resilient infrastructure about how to clean up the river, both a social and an ecological and a kind of built environment rejuvenation model. And their aim is to scale that up all along the pathway of the river. So from source ultimately to sea, which is obviously a very ambitious project, but in the very early stages, at least from source, for the first few kilometers of the river's flow through the city. And their vision is to build a kind of green corridor that city residents can enjoy as a green space, can walk along, that is, of course, clean, that is in some way contributing to the betterment of urban life. So I learned about this project, Water for the Future, from my friend, Romy Stander. There she is. She's one of the founders of this NGO. She volunteered to start cleaning up the river through some other work that she was doing, and it kind of snowballed into this quite big and quite complex project. So just a couple of methodological notes. I'm kind of playing an interesting role in this project. I'm kind of part communications advisor, part participant observer. I think because of my friendship with one of the founders of the NGO, I was invited to get involved, offer support and advice where possible, where necessary. So I'm an observer, but of course I'm not neutral, and it's quite hard to keep a critical distance from projects like this. You know, it's my home city. It's a very fascinating and exciting project, and it's quite hard to not get caught up in the idealism and the excitement of the activists and this network that they're building in order to try and clean up and save the headwaters of this river. So the NGO is very small. It's seed funded by a restaurant chain, Nando's, which some of you might know, because their headquarters are just a block away from the daylight point of the river. So, and because of the kind of cultural connection with Mozambican food and the fact that the river eventually meets the ocean in Mozambique at Xai-Xai, I think the the company was quite interested in putting some of their resources into this social environmental issue. Okay, so I'm an observer, but I'm not neutral. I've come to the project relatively recently. I've become an observer kind of early on in the year, this year. So they trust me, they've let me in, they've given me access to their archives of materials that they're building up. You know, I'm literally and figuratively in the WhatsApp group. So I have this kind of privileged position to absorb and to listen in. And going forward, my aim is to work with them collaboratively in both developing their communication strategies, but also kind of analyzing and theorizing them. And what I'm presenting here today is a first step in that, is to just have a look at some of the narrative strategies for the existing media coverage that they have achieved, and to look at what kinds of stories were the stories that caught the attention of editors and journalists. So this is a very qualitative kind of piece of work. There's only a small number, but of quite detailed long form pieces that came out organically. So there wasn't like a specific communication strategy that these activists were using and following through their own networks, through their work, through kind of more organic ways of connecting with journalists and media. A couple of key pieces of coverage came out. And I'm going to talk about 3 themes that I've identified in that narrative, which gives, I think, a little bit of insight into how stories like this come into the public eye, and perhaps gives us some clue as to thinking about how stories like this can be strategically deployed to gain the kind of support and public awareness that projects like this need in order to succeed. So there are 3 main narratives, which I summarize as adventure, filth, and hope. I'll talk about these each quickly. I think I've only got a few minutes left. So adventure. Joburg is a very adventurous city. There's a lot of adventure to be had here, some of it exciting and some of it less so. So this theme of adventure came up in this important article written by Sean Christie, who's quite a well-established journalist. He's also working on a book about the Yukskay. And the particular story that happened here is that one of the activists, Haneli Kutsia, also a very kind of well-known eco-artist in South Africa, who was involved in also starting up this NGO, and a couple of city officials and this journalist, Sean Christie, went on an expedition underneath the city to try and find the source of the Yukskay. So the Yukskay, almost immediately from the moment that it sees daylight, is filthy. It is, again, E. coli, rubbish, all of the things that you might imagine. And this group went on this expedition to find the source. So they entered the sewerage and stormwater drain tunnels underneath the city. They encountered all sorts of dangers and kind of escapades in order to find the source. And it's quite an interesting narrative, because normally when adventurers and explorers go to search for the source of a river, you know, they're navigating wild landscapes, but here it's a different kind of wild and a different kind of landscape underneath the city, hiking through dark, swampy, polluted sewerage tunnels, facing many possible risks on this quest. And this kind of language comes up quite a lot in this particular article from the Sunday Times in February this year. Spoiler alert, they do find a pure source. So there is this kind of quest that is fulfilled in this narrative. Deep under the city, they find a trickle of pure spring water coming out of a pipe, which they tested along with scientists, and they found that it was pure. And then it immediately drains into kind of the toxic connectivity of all of the other pipes and sewage leaks, etc., under the city. Okay, so this adventure narrative is key. I'm going to move on real quick. The second theme, and you'll already have probably guessed at this, is the filth, right? So as with, unfortunately, this is sad truth with many of our other rivers, probably all of our other rivers, the Yukskay is toxic from source almost. And this is accentuated in a lot of the media coverage that has existed so far about it. And this piece written by Joe Walsh, which came out quite recently in the Bloomberg, pretty much sums it up with this, I think, quite catchy headline of Johannesburg's dirty little river. So, you know, the journalists and reporters will focus on the very vivid visuals of the kind of trash that has been found in this river. Dead dogs, old TVs, endless amounts of plastic, used needles. And then the filth of the river is kind of discussed both scientifically in terms of what's visible and invisible. So the scientific measurements of the invisible waste and toxicity, such as E. coli. Images of scientists in gumboots and khakis holding up test tubes, you know, squinting into the light, kind of illustrate that search for the invisible toxicity, but the visible toxicity is visually represented through kind of the piles of trash. And this, of course, is linked to some of the social problems that we experience in South Africa. So quickly going to race onto the third theme, which is hope. So I think specifically because it was, you know, women, ecological and art activists who started this project, there is a narrative of hope also in the coverage of this project. And this is specifically kind of covered in this piece by Kim Harrisberg for Thomson Reuters. And here the emphasis is placed on the strategies, the interventions that are being designed and experimented with by the activists, by the NGO, about how the headwaters are being rejuvenated. And one of the strategies is the removal of alien invasive vegetation. And you can see this pictured here. Local jobs were created for local people who live alongside the river. And here is a quote from one of these alien invasive plant removers, Sylvester Kumwenda, who says, quoted in this very article, "If we can heal our environment, then our young ones will know what nature looks like, and that is priceless." So hope is deployed here as a news value to try and capture the attention of the reader. And I think there is perhaps some thing to be optimistic about in terms of how this narrative might be able to mobilize community activism and engagement rather than just paralyze us with doom and gloom and worry about the future. So as I've said, this is a work in progress. I've given a very analytical summary, but I'm hoping that from this study, we can develop more kind of practice-oriented approaches to figure out how to deploy what effective communication strategies can support this kind of work. Thank you. I hope I didn't go too far over time.
Thanks, Mahida. Another really, really interesting presentation. I'm just mindful of the time. We've got Kirsty Stiles coming up next from the University of Central Lancashire. Public interest journalism on a post-abundance planet, investigating how UK news media organisations are assessing and addressing their environmental impact. Kirsty, I'm sorry, we've only got 12 minutes left and I'm hoping that you won't get cut off in the middle of it. So I'll stop talking and let you start.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. I don't have slides, so I'm just going to go for it, and you might have to just tip me off the stage if necessary. So good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. Really delighted to be able to be here in Australia for the first time. I know that many of you have been here all day, so I will try and keep my contribution as brief as I can. As has been said, my name is Kirsty Stiles. I first studied at the University of Central Lancashire in the northwest of England as an undergraduate journalist, way before everyone had smartphones and when student life wasn't conducted by instant messages. I went on to work as a technology journalist and an editor in London, eventually working at the New Statesman. I'm now a lecturer in journalism innovation at the University of Huddersfield and also back at UCLan as the first person funded to do a PhD by the World Association of Newspapers and News Publishers. Today I'm going to give an overview of my PhD, still with a provisional title, Public Interest Journalism on a Post-Abundance Planet. So I'm sure we would all agree that 2020 represented a challenging, tragic year for people, planet, and maybe even public interest journalism, all operating under the spectre of a global pandemic that has very sadly taken lives and livelihoods away in an instant. But 2020, you may know, was also supposed to be a super year for climate after almost 2 decades of moderate progress on reducing our global carbon emissions, which had actually been followed by slowed decarbonisation in 2018 because of rising energy demand, and which was unfortunately met with increased use of fossil fuels in many parts of the world. The COVID-19 pandemic has led, among many other things, to the United Nations postponing the COP26 climate talks in Glasgow. And yet there have been huge positive changes in the way that people live and work that may have lasting positive environmental consequences, not least a huge reduction in flying, being one of the most stark. Although it does have to be said that the International Energy Agency also warned early on about the likelihood of a so-called rebound effect when eventually things get back to normal. Now, public interest journalism has experienced both feast and famine during this time. There's been record news consumption, including local news, but this has been seen alongside concerns about trust and the spreading of misinformation on topics of public concern. And this has not been met with record revenues for news media organisations. This crisis has further highlighted problems with one of the dominant business models for public interest journalism, advertising, which fell away initially due to a contraction in demand as people lost their jobs or lost their usual uses of their free time, and so stopped consuming media in the same way. But advertisers were then found to be diverting money away from news media, because who wants to see their brand appearing alongside such relentless bad news? Now, you'll know some publishers such as the UK's Guardian have for a number of years been trying to establish more surety through the pursuit of reader revenues, subscriptions, membership or donation schemes, but this kind of spending may be considered a luxury today for those who have seen their income reduced or lost entirely. Eventually, despite something of a need to know, people have been found to be experiencing news fatigue, with John Alsop over at the Columbia Journalism Review saying speaking the unspeakable by asking, should we publish less on the pandemic, questioning whether real-time information was really ensuring that people are more well informed. Now, due to such incredible upheaval, it would have been easy to forget that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change told us in 2018 that the world had just 12, now 9 years to act. Had it not been for wildfires, floods, and today the first climate change created drought in Madagascar, along with the panel's latest work, which has already been mentioned, released just this month, billing our current situation as Code Red for Humanity. What's not broadly changed during this time is the scientific consensus that human activity is changing the state of the planet. But what still remains less certain is how best to address this, mitigate it or adapt, capture and store carbon, or create new sinks through the planting of trees or peat bog restoration, and many questions more besides. But what's even less discussed is that climate change represents just one of 9 planetary boundaries identified by environmental scientists as ceiling limits for the environmental impact across our key planetary systems. Several of these are interrelated and all have the potential to be breached, and still they represent only a limited range of environmental harms that are of concern, others of which could include precious mineral use for something like smartphones, and of course, just what do we do with all of this waste? It's easy when you start out on a project like this, I'm sure many of you seasoned academics will know, to think that you're the first one here and this is all new. But one thing I realized pretty early on was a lot of this stuff really isn't new at all. It was a pioneer of the scientific method, Francis Bacon, who may have unwittingly made the first notes of the relationship between media innovation and environmental destruction around the turn of the 1600s, when he said it was printing, gunpowder, and the mariner's needle. These 3 things have changed the whole face and state of things throughout the world. And the idea of sustainable development was captured rather well in the late 1700s by Edmund Burke, considered the father of modern conservatism, when he said that society is indeed a contract between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. And when you're considering whether journalism is meeting the social challenge of informing people about issues of public importance, it might be highlighted that the media and the wider business world have known about what we could call limits to growth related to our growing human impact on our finite planet for at least half a century. The text of the same name was first published in 1972. And yet still, it was almost 100 years earlier, when Svante Arrhenius was writing in 1896, that one of the first links was made between fossil fuel emissions specifically and global temperature change. Now, since then, academics who may call themselves materialist media ecologists, including, I'm a big fan of Maxwell and Miller, Lewis, Lopez, Rausch, and Fuchs, have all added their efforts to a more than half a millennium long story of what we may accurately call creative destruction. Over more than 100 years, media innovation, economic development, and environmental destruction go hand in hand. Most recently, this includes mineral mining for devices wiping out a population of gorillas in Africa, chlorine poisoning the sea during filmmaking for the film of Titanic, as it happens, and media rubbish in space, and of course, mobile phone towers killing birds. An initial challenge for my research, broadly answered by these academics, was establishing that the media has a footprint. It's not weightless, even when it is digital. So then what is left to be done? As I said, although much of the heavy lifting has been done to establish the materiality of the media, little original research has been done to look at the news media organisations' approach to dealing with this in any detail. Media scholars often consider CSR, responsibility, ethical questions, rather than questions of business survival or sustainability. That may be because in theoretical terms, there's a tension in the broader sustainable development literature related to the pursuit of so-called sustainable development. The implication in its definition is that the three pillars of sustainable development, the economic, the environmental, and the social, are equal, but critics across various disciplines, including media scholars like Maxwell and Miller, say the economic always wins. So in my research, I'm keen to understand if news media organisations are attempting to engage in such sustainable development, how this tension plays out within a news media organisation specifically. The two UK-based cases have been chosen because they have different corporate and corporate structures and business models, which I believe will help to explore the tension identified in the literature between economic and environmental sustainability. Does your climate coverage come with a side of SUVs, for example? Similarly, sustainable development doesn't always appear to retain the intergenerational spirit articulated by Burke and brought into use in the UN's Our Common Future report. In the UK, at least, there's a lack of UK government strategy for the news media to play its part in addressing these issues, or even an overview of the work done in this area by news media organisations themselves, much of which only hit the headlines in late 2019 and early 2020 as commitments to becoming net zero. So as such, this research will be among the first to interrogate how the recent global drive to net zero is shaping environmental sustainability plans at UK news media organisations. To date, you may know, net zero does not have a working definition for organisations to deploy. And in quite a contradiction to this net zero approach, the UK's Committee on Climate Change said in 2019 that most sectors will need to reduce their emissions close to zero without offsetting. This study also brings into the critical question of brain print, which was first articulated in 2004 to refer to the reasonably unique power that the news media has to influence people. This study tries to understand the potential of brain print of each organisation's editorial work. Does this reflect, undermine, or reinforce its organisational sustainability approach? Are they saying one thing and doing another? And given that we are where we are, has the news media failed us here? And finally, this thesis will seek to establish an operational definition of sustainable journalism. You may know that the UK is one of the largest historical contributors to climate change, but it has recently claimed global climate leadership. And so this thick analysis of two cases should help us understand how sustainable journalism really is here. I will leave it there. I'd love to chat more and would be really keen to speak to anybody who's doing content analysis in any detail. Just a cheeky shout out.
Kirsty, I want to read that. That sounds so fascinating. Thank you so much for that presentation. Thank you to everyone for your really thought-provoking presentations. We're going to have to get out of this room because we're about to have a whole bunch of other people drop in for the next session. But if you've got questions or comments, please keep them because there will be drinks and closing sort of hour-long chat at 5 o'clock our time, so in another hour from now, for those of you who aren't in Melbourne. Love to have you join us, and yeah, we can probably sort of meet up and ask each other questions at that point. Rita, okay. So that's all good to know. And this will be recorded. This is all being recorded as well. I missed the very part of the first presentation because I couldn't record, Julie, but most of it will be there. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm really sorry we have to rush off, but lots to think about and really great presentations. See you. Thanks.
Thank you very much.